Hi guys, and welcome back to more English with Dry. Today we are taking a look at the third and final part of An Inspector Calls, Act 1. Where we left off, Sheila was beginning to be interrogated by the inspector. She hears of the unpleasant business and immediately asks whether or not it was an accident. This concern she shows really presents her as being very different to her father. He, of course, was dismissive, almost irritated by the news in the beginning, whereas she seems to care, at least a little. It presents her as being a polar opposite of Arthur Burling, something that will, of course, become much more relevant as the play develops. She's then informed of the role that her father played in discharging Eva from his works, to which Burling says that he was justified. Gerald immediately agrees with him, and therefore he is presented as being someone who is very like-minded, with Arthur Burling. It presents both of them as being part of the traditional capitalist upper-class school of thought. And this is interesting because in terms of the age divide in this play, Gerald falls somewhere in between. He's not as young as Eric and Sheila, but also not as old as Arthur and Sybil. And so it puts him as a sort of problem character who doesn't quite fit that nicely into either of those boxes. Sheila immediately shows signs of distress at hearing about this and talks about how happy she has been tonight. Now, this is something that is quite interesting because it shows her awareness for the first time that even though she is happy, not everyone else is. Now, this could be the first sign that Sheila is actually more aware of the world than we thought to begin with. Of course, she is presented as being the archetype of childishness to begin with. However, here there's an indication of her acknowledging her own fortune and the fact that she's been lucky enough to be born into a happy house with means and enough wealth to shield her from some of life's more unpleasant things. However, she then immediately asks whether the girl was pretty. And so this kind of childish, immature side to her, this obsession with looks that is just the same as what Arthur Burling began to talk about, reminds us that she has been brought up in this world. She's been brought up to value things like looks in a woman. And so it raises the interesting question of whether or not we blame her for this. Do we blame Sheila for being totally superficial? After all, this is probably what she has been taught to be her entire life. So it's a good question to consider in your essay writing, the extent to which we can hold her accountable for her ignorance at the start of the play. However, it is not instantaneous either that this disappears, because as we can see, she demands to know whether Eva Smith was pretty, as though that would make some sort of difference. This is something the inspector then comments upon. She wasn't pretty when I saw her today. Now, this is a sort of reminder of the really horrible thing that has happened to this woman, a really stark attempt to shock the Burlings and Gerald, and also remind them of what is at stake in his investigation here. Burling discovers that the inspector is not simply here to interrogate him, and there is a marked change of tone. Of course, until this point, he's been getting increasingly irritated and frustrated with the inspector. Now, however, he apologizes. Now, the reason behind this is not necessarily that he is sorry for anything. However, he has realized that he is not going to be the only person being blamed here. It doesn't actually make a difference, as he says it does. However, it does to him. Because it's not going to be, therefore, purely an exercise in making him look bad. There is going to be somebody else who has to pay a price for what has happened to Eva Smith. This is something the inspector then immediately acknowledges. The girl's dead, though. And this, of course, is a reminder to Burling that he still fired her, and therefore there is an irrefutable amount of guilt he must feel for this. Burling interrupts Sheila to try and silence her and, speak to the inspector properly, but then Sheila interrupts him back. Cutting in is the stage direction. And for the first time, she, therefore, speaks over her father. Now, until this point, we have seen Sheila as being of the Burling family, at least, the kind of bottom of the food chain, if you like. She is the most subservient as the youngest woman. She has done everything that her mother and father have told her to, everything that Gerald has told her to, because that is the way that it was supposed to be. But the fact is that she interrupts her father shows that there is the beginnings of a character change. It does not take long for the inspector to have an impact on Sheila. Her curiosity for this affair, and also her desire to know the full extent of what has happened to Eva Smith, and maybe what part she played in it, is causing her to behave quite unusually, but also in a more grown-up way. She also then accuses her father, saying it was a mean thing to do and perhaps it spoilt everything for her. Now, this is the first awakening of this socialist idea of the inspectors, that our actions have consequences on other people, consequences that we cannot know perhaps for quite a while. And therefore, Sheila is starting to align herself with the inspector in this way. Burling then says rubbish, which just proves his complete, stubborn refusal to accept anything like this. The inspector then gives a brief recap of what happened to Eva Smith being out of work. However, we also hear more about her personal life. She has few friends, she's lonely, she's half-starved, and she's feeling desperate, to which Sheila responds warmly. Now, this is the beginning of Sheila's sympathy for Eva Smith. She's displaying a very human emotion here, the human emotion of compassion, something that we are yet to see from Burling, Gerald, or Eric. She is showing empathy, which is something that, until now, we would not imagine she's capable of doing. We imagine she wouldn't be able to put herself in Eva's shoes, because her shoes are obviously far more expensive. And the inspector kind of senses this and presses home his advantage. He says there are lots of young women living this life. And this reminds us that this poverty, this really desperate existence is something that affects a lot of people. And then to which Sheila says, but these girls aren't cheap labour, they're people. Now, if you're going to learn any quotes from the play to do with characters, I would recommend learning this one, because it really summarises Sheila's path towards socialist ideals, or at the very least, accepting responsibility for her behaviour and starting to see the working class not as numbers, not as tools to be exploited, but as individual people with their own lives. And also, as we've mentioned, the chance that she has, as somebody who is well off, to impact their happiness. And so in this way, she's embracing the inspector's socialism in this one comment. And the inspector, of course, says very dryly, I've had that notion myself from time to time. In fact, he is, of course, realizing that Sheila has got his point. We then begin to have the dots joined for Sheila. Eva Smith went to work at Millward's, a favourite department store and clothing shop of the Burling family. And she says that she was in Millward's only that day for your benefit to Gerald. Now, this is a reminder that her transformation is not complete. It's important not to talk about how as soon as the inspector has spoken to Sheila, she immediately becomes a fully fledged member of the Socialist Party. It's not the case. But this comment, I was there this afternoon, sounds vaguely ridiculous now after the more serious things we've been talking about. It's showing her sheltered belief that she must look nice for Gerald. But it's interesting that she comments that, because it almost indicates that she is realizing how nonsensical it is to behave in that way. Gerald, of course, smiles and says good, because that's all he can think to do. Burling then begins to try to solve the mystery himself. And she got herself into trouble, I suppose, is what he asks. Now, this is him in a way very similar to what his wife does later, but not quite to the same extent. But it displays his assumption that it is her own fault. It's his inbuilt prejudice against members of the working class, his assumption that they would be the ones who are responsible for the problems in their own lives. And this goes back to the time of Dickens and the Victorians, this idea, this sort of Scrooge-like idea that people who live in poverty deserve to do so somehow. He then says, not doing her work properly. Now, this might be that because of the fact that he knows Eva Smith to have been a troublemaker, or at least he considers her as such. But you have to remember, she wasn't a bad worker. There was no sense that her work quality was low. It was obviously the fact that she was demanding higher pay that got her sacked from Burling's factory. But it simply just fits his worldview that somebody like Eva Smith would be sacked because of something she has done. It's impossible for him to conceive of that there would be any foul play or any sense of harsh or unfair treatment on the part of her employers, who, would be successful, wealthy people. The inspector, of course, refutes this immediately, saying there was nothing wrong with the way she was doing her work. But Burling can't even fathom this. There must have been something wrong, he says. At which point Sheila becomes agitated. It's almost like she's begun to realise who Eva Smith was. She clearly has a recollection of what it was she did, and perhaps this is starting to swim to the surface of her mind. She knows that she was probably the customer who complained. And then, of course, when the inspector shows her the photograph, Sheila is confirmed. Now, this causes Sheila a great deal of pain and unhappiness, and Burling asks angrily, why the devil do you want to go upsetting the child like that? Now, this is proof that Burling treats his daughter like a child. He calls her as such, but also he is indicating that she should be protected from learning upsetting things. Now, Sheila is not a child. Sheila is a fully grown adult woman. We hear that she is in her mid to early 20s. And so the fact that he is treating her in this way would probably explain why she is so immature, as we've already talked about. And again, this is something the inspector refutes. He says, I didn't do it, she's upsetting herself. And this is a reminder that the inspector sees Sheila as having her own will, her own ability to do things, and this is something that he respects enough to be able to blame her for what she has done. Burling then comments on the nasty mess that the inspector has made of their evening, which reminds the audience that he can only see how what is going on affects him. It's almost like he's already forgotten that a young woman has died because of his and now his daughter's actions towards her. All he's fussed about is their celebration has become ruined. The inspector, of course, retorts to him steadily that it was actually a life that was made a mess of. And so that is the sort of logical, realistic response that is given there. But it's a stark reminder that Burling is stubbornly refusing to take anything the inspector says on board. Burling leaves the room to go and retrieve Sheila, at which point Gerald and Eric have a brief interchange with the inspector. Gerald demands to see the photograph. Eric demands to see the photograph and begins to drink. Now, this scene is not really about Eric, but it's worth including this in our notes and our analysis because he describes how he is a bit drunk. And this just is worth recalling that he is someone who abuses alcohol. He has too much of it. And actually, while his mother and father are not there to defend him, it makes him sound vaguely tragic and pathetic. Gerald protests to the inspector over how he's conducting the investigation. He says, quite importantly, "We're respectable citizens and not criminals," parroting the often cited belief that people of the upper classes cannot do anything wrong. And indeed, they were more often than not protected from the law by this very fact. Remember, we've already heard that Arthur Burling is best friends with the chief of police and plays golf with him. But the inspector says sometimes there isn't much difference as you think. And now that is pure Priestley coming through there. Is his belief that actually the real crime in society is having enough money and enough influence to be able to make life better for everyone, but refusing to do so. It's quite similar to the contemporary view about billionaires being immoral in their very nature. Priestley is very much somebody who would hold that view now and sees what the Burlings do as being utterly criminal, even though it may not be technically against the law. Sheila has returned, and she says miserably, "So I'm really responsible." Now, this is her doing something that Arthur singularly could not. She takes the blame. She accepts that she has carried out an action that has had consequences for another individual. It's a very simple sentence, but it's very, very fitting because it's the truth. It shows a level of maturity in Sheila that actually is not necessarily matched by her father and her mother or her fiancé. Now, she says that the reason she did it was because she was in a furious temper, which really means she was having a childish temper tantrum. Now, this is something that she is acknowledging here as being childish. However, it all fits in with this image of Sheila that we have from the beginning of her being like a spoilt brat. And Gerald sort of tries to mitigate things or make things better by giving her presumably a sympathetic look, but she snaps and bites his head off. "You needn't look at me like that. At least I'm trying to tell the truth. I expect you've done things that you're ashamed of too." Now, this is interesting because it's the first time she's talking in anger at her own fiancé, somebody who until now she has totally deferred to and everything. But it's also loaded with the hidden meaning. It's almost as if she knows exactly what he has been doing, We've talked about how Sheila is intelligent and probably knows exactly what Gerald has been up to, but has refused to acknowledge it. However, this is an indication, absolutely, that we are soon going to find out the thing that Gerald is ashamed of. Sheila then describes the event and instantly comments on the prettiness of this woman. Now, this contributes to her level of jealousy because, this is fundamentally why she does this, is jealousy. She is jealous of Eva's looks. She's jealous of the fact they are better than her own. And this is why she gets her sacked. But it's also quite similar to how Sybil responds later on in the play, because it's almost as though she cannot allow somebody who is beneath her, socially and in every sense, to be better looking than her. She views it as being not fair, almost her God-given right to be pretty. And therefore she cannot allow this. She sees Eva Smith as a threat to her, perhaps because men will prefer her, and obviously because she has been brought up to believe that her attractiveness to men is her true value. Therefore, this is why she reacts in the way she does. She even comments if she'd been some miserable plain little creature, then she wouldn't perhaps have done it. Which is a truly shocking thing to say. She admits here that she has purely taken her anger out on a pretty girl for nothing more than being prettier than she is. The crime of envy that Sheila carries out is not to be underestimated in this play. Sheila, yes, is very repentant, and we can all laud her for her acceptance of what she has done and her willingness to change. But it should not detract from the spitefulness of what she does. And the inspector reminds her of this in no uncertain terms. You used the power you had. He is reminding her that she has got power. She is trying to remind the Burlings at all times that the position they are in means that they have power over other people. They can make their lives better or worse as they choose. These things do not happen in isolation, they do not happen by accident, they happen due to very deliberate choices. Sheila, of course, says that she wishes that she could help her, but the inspector says harshly, now this implies his level of judgment of her. He is not just a silent narrator of events that have happened, he has come to judge them. He has come to criticize them. It's too late, she's dead. Very, very simple prophetic sentences. Ones that should not be forgotten. And certainly, it's fair to say Sheila does not forget them. Now, Sheila says at the end of a stormy sentence or a stormy short piece of dialogue, she asks, why had this to happen? And the inspector reminds her that that's what he asked himself when he saw Eva Smith's body, and it's reminding her that Eva's death is the real tragedy here. And that actually Sheila should not get so absorbed in her own grief that she forgets this, that she forgets that the tragedy is the death of a woman. And this is, in fairness, again, something Sheila takes on. And then he gives away the short piece of information that this woman changed her name to Daisy Renton. Gerald immediately is startled by this. And this is where he goes and pours himself a drink. Now again, it's his turn because he realizes he's been implicated and the panic sets in. Now we've talked about how alcohol acts in this play as a symbol for not taking responsibility. Gerald realizes that he has got something he is going to have to take responsibility for. And to lessen this feeling of guilt, this burden, he starts to take a drink just to numb everything. Again, alcohol is functioning as this motif, that as a tool that the upper classes use to excuse themselves from having to deal with the consequences of what it is they do. Sheila then starts talking just to Gerald, and she interrogates him in a way very reminiscent of the inspector. How did you come to know this girl? She demands of him. Don't be stupid. Now, not only is she now talking to Gerald in a completely different way from the beginning, where she fawned all over him, and she was totally in his thrall and thought marrying him was the highest thing she could achieve in her life. She is questioning him like she is the inspector. Now, again, this links her to him. This mimicry almost makes her seem like a kind of acolyte or a follower of the inspectors at this point, which is what Priestley is trying to do. But it presents that she has grown up in a very short space of time, very fast. And Gerald is utterly bewildered by it. He has no idea what to say. He tries to fob her off. He tries to say, oh, let's leave it at that, that I knew her. But Sheila will not let this lie. She tells him, in no uncertain terms, that she is going to find out what he has done, and he is going to have to admit it, because the inspector is going to make him. Sheila has grasped the almost supernatural power the inspector has already. The dynamic between the pair has completely altered. And this is, of course, something that Gerald does not like in the slightest. Now, Gerald, of course, being the man he is, will not take any sort of responsibility. He says that he's sorry to his fiancée, but it was all over and done with the previous summer, and he hadn't seen the girl in 6 months before her suicide, and so it's nothing to do with him. Sheila says, oh, I thought the same as you half an hour ago, but I've realised the difference. And Gerald protests again. He says, well, none of us come into this for God's sake. We are not involved. If ever we needed reminding that Gerald does not show a change in the way that his fiancée Sheila does, it's this. Because he is still trying to deny it. He's still trying to deny his responsibility. And even though he has heard very clearly what Sheila has done, he's trying to deny her responsibility. Gerald's cowardice here is the thing that is most notable. Burling can be accused of being stubborn. Gerald, I think it's fair to say, is a coward. And as Act 1 ends, we realise and we truly appreciate how Gerald is about to get the same treatment that Sheila and Arthur have had. I hope you found this video to be helpful. In a short series soon, I will be starting to explore Act 2. Remember to like and subscribe, and take care.